Greetings, everyone. My name is Afonso Morango, and I welcome you all to our Diplomacy and Beyond series, an initiative of the Institute for Cultural Relations Policy in Budapest. Founded in 2012, the Institute for Cultural Relations Policy aims at fostering scientific education and public discourse regarding cultural relations. At the Institute, we believe that cultural relations policies will be a key factor in international relations for the 21st century, and therefore our work focuses on global intercultural dialogue and cooperation, aiming to promote the protection of human rights and recognition of cultural diversity and heritage in an increasingly interdependent world. Diplomacy and Beyond began in 2015 as a highly popular event which brought together the world of diplomacy to youth. Discussions were held by interns in our headquarters in Budapest, followed by Q&A sessions with the audience. However, due to obvious restrictions imposed by the pandemic, this event is being held online this time. This session of Diplomacy and Beyond will consist of our distinguished guests' address on the theme Rashid Khalidi's prescription for solidarity with the Palestinian people, followed by a moderated interview. And towards the end of the session, the audience can interact with our guest and put forward further questions. This webinar is a part of the Visegrad Academic of Cultural Diplomacy project. The project is supported by the Polish Ministry for Culture, National Heritage and Sport, and co-financed by the Cultural Promotion Fund. The Visegrad Academy of Cultural Diplomacy project is coordinated by the Institute of Economic Diplomacy in Poland and partnered by the Institute for Cultural Relations Policy in Hungary, Young Conservatives in Czech Republic, and Civic Democratic Youth in Slovakia. Today, we have with us Dr. David Frank, a professor emeritus of rhetoric and political communication in the Robert T. Clark Honors College at the University of Oregon. Professor Frank studies the use of rhetoric and argumentative reason in valid conflicts. He writes and teaches courses on rhetorical history and theory, civil rights rhetoric, the Israeli-Palestinian relationship, and the prevention of genocide and mass atrocities. He has received research awards alone and in collaboration with colleagues from the Mellon Foundation, Stanley Foundation, the National Endowment for Humanities, the National Science Foundation, and the Korea Research Foundation. Professor Frank has been interviewed by reporters from the Washington Post, National Public Radio, and the host of other American and international media sources. He was recognized with the Article of the Year Award by the Communications and Religion Association. He also served a 5-year term as the Academic Dean of the Clark Honors College and has received 6 teaching awards in his career. Without further delay, I would now like to give the floor to Dr. David Frank. Professor, thank you again for being here with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alfonso, and it's a deep honor for me to be speaking to the forum. I will have about 15 minutes to make 4 points, and these points are important, I think, if we're going to achieve solidarity with the Palestinian people. I begin by observing that I have personally witnessed the suffering of the Palestinian people. I have been in Gaza. I've been to several Palestinian refugee camps. I have witnessed exchanges and dialogues between Israeli peace activists and Palestinian peace activists. I have seen with my own eyes, I've heard with my own ears, the suffering that the Palestinians have endured. And it is a problem that the international community needs to take more seriously, to act on, and to engage both Israelis and Palestinians in efforts to achieve reconciliation. I also agree with the 2 most prominent scholars of the Palestinian issue, Rashid Khalidi and Edward Said, recognize that there are two peoples on the same land in the area of Palestine and Israel, and that the goal would be to help both people achieve some sort of reconciliation. I do not believe as a person, nor do I think many Palestinians or Israelis believe that violence will resolve the issue. There are those who believe in Israel that the Palestinians should just go away, they should leave the territory of the country of Israel and go to Syria and the surrounding Arab countries. There are some Palestinians that wish that the Israeli Jews would go back to their countries of origin. And those perceptions, I think, are profoundly misguided. And that is why I joined Edward Said, Rashid Khalidi, and also the majority of Palestinian people, according to a recent poll conducted in October of 2021, that the majority of Palestinians believe that the problem facing them can be resolved with a treaty or some sort of arrangement with the Israeli government that would allow both peoples to live in peace. So now the question becomes, what can the international community do? What can the United States do? What can Hungary do? What can your forum do to promote actions that can reduce? Alfonso shared with me 8 questions that the interns have posed. And what I'd like to do is to try to answer some of them in the course of my discussion of 4 points. The first point is that we do need to commit to reducing Palestinian suffering. The Palestinians inside of Israel are suffering. Just this year, 117 Palestinian Israeli Arabs have been murdered in their own community. They are often, Palestinians in Israel, treated as second-class citizens, and they do not enjoy the same rights as the Israeli citizens of Israel. The Palestinians on the West Bank are suffering from an occupation that started in 1967 that is brutal and has been condemned by every single human rights organization in the world. Hamas and the Palestinians living in Gaza are living in what's essentially an open prison, and their life is miserable. And again, I've seen the misery with my own eyes. The Palestinians in the diaspora are also caught in a web of misery because there's not much they can do from their posture outside of the Middle East, although they do their best to advocate for the cause of the Palestinians in their respective states outside of Palestine. And so my first point is that we should all join together in suffering. In so doing, we need to better understand how to frame the Palestinian problem and to explain Palestinian suffering. Rashid Khalidi, who is the Edward Said Professor at Columbia University, has written probably the most important book on the issue that I will draw from. He is also the editor of the Journal of Palestine Studies. And so I draw from him intellectual inspiration about how to explain and frame the Palestinian issue. At the end of his most recent book, he identified 3 frames that we might use to understand Palestinian suffering. One is to look at the problem of Palestine and Israel through the lens of colonial settler. And the argument would be that Israel is a colonial settler state and that the area should be decolonized. That is probably the most popular paradigm or way of understanding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the Western intellectual world. And there are progressive Christian churches in America that are making use of the colonial settler paradigm to condemn Israel, to call Israel an apartheid state. So that's the first frame. The second frame, Khalidi argues that we might use power frame. And that theme or that frame suggests that the Palestinians have much less power than the Israelis. The Israeli government is supported by the US government to the tune of almost $4 billion every year. The US government has provided support for the Iron Dome defense system, and the US government has close ties with the Israeli government to the disadvantage of the Palestinians. One of the interns did ask a good question about the difference between the Biden administration's approach to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and the Trump administration approach. I can tell you, as someone who is a progressive Democrat, I'll just declare my allegiances. I am so happy that Joe Biden is president. And I was ashamed as an American that Donald Trump was president. Now, that said, I do believe that the Biden administration has made some modest steps to correct the imbalance the US government has displayed in favoring the Israelis over the Palestinians since his election. He has spoken about the need to sustain equality between Israelis and Palestinians. He is on the brink of reinstituting the consulate in Jerusalem, where the Americans and the Palestinians can meet. And in January of 2021, he reinstituted the $250 million donation to, in turn, goes to help support Palestinian issues. At the same time, Biden still tilts in favor of the Israeli government. And I would urge all of us, I would urge Americans, my colleagues here, my fellow citizens, to press the American government and their representatives to reduce Palestinian suffering by placing significant pressure on the Israelis to stop the settlement activities and to stop the actions of the IDF and the Shitban and the other organizations in Israel from abusing and often torturing Palestinians. And so the third option that Rashid Khalidi suggested that we use is one that features equality. And when he compares the three frames at the end of this book, The 100 Years War, Khalidi then says that the equality frame is the best one to use. And that's where the forum that you have organized, I think, comes into play, because if there is going to be a resolution, if there ever is one, to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it will need to come through cultural diplomacy and not through violence. And that's where I would like to make the emphasis in my third point. The cultural diplomacy to be the means by which the Israelis and the Palestinians come to terms with their similarities and differences. And I would like to point to a member of the Knesset. The Knesset is the parliament in Israel, who is an Palestinian, he's an Arab, but he's also a citizen of the state of Israel. And so he lives in, this is Ayman Odeh. He is the head of the Balad party, and he was elected in 2015 to the Knesset. He makes the argument that Israelis and Palestinians need to learn to live together under the umbrella of democracy. And he makes the argument that Israel was founded in 1948 as both a Jewish state and as a democracy. Now, the two seem to be in contradiction, which they are. But Ayman Odeh is now making the argument that if Israel becomes a true democracy, then all the citizens in the state will retain equal rights. Ayman Odeh, who is from Haifa and is a Palestinian Arab, he supports a two-state solution and also equal rights for Palestinian and Israeli citizens in the state of Israel. That's his platform. And he is aspiring to become the first Arab prime minister of Israel. Now, that may just blow your mind. It is a vision that he has set forth as a member of the Knesset that I think does have some promise. And his campaign, his frame, his approach is based upon cultural diplomacy. He is engaged in what I believe is a revolutionary action. As a Palestinian Arab, he is trying to understand and communicate with Jewish citizens of Israel. In so doing, he acknowledges the fact that the Jews experienced a great trauma in the form of the Holocaust. And between 1933 and 1945 in Europe, some 7 million Jews were murdered. Now, the Palestinians had nothing to do with the Holocaust. They didn't cause it, they didn't promote it. The cause of the Holocaust can be traced to anti-Semitism in Europe, not to any actions that the Palestinians did. At the same time, the Jews in Israel are still operating under and within that trauma. And so Ayman Odeh recognizes that trauma, acknowledges that it took place, and is willing to work through that trauma with fellow citizens of who are Jewish. So then I reach a fourth point. How should we assess Khalidi and Odeh's frame? Khalidi is arguing that equality, not the colonial settler frame and not power, but equality should be the most effective way for the Palestinians to make their case. And Ayman Odeh, who is a member of the Israeli parliament, is making the argument that equality is the most important frame to use to reduce Palestinian suffering. So the fourth point I'd like to share with you then is to assess Khalidi's and Odeh's argument. Is a focus on equality the most effective approach? I think it is. I think there are some good arguments for the other frames as well. It is quite persuasive to frame the construction of Israel as a result of colonial, settler, imperial ideology. I think there's evidence to substantiate that claim. However, we are now in a period where the most useful way to approach the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is through the process of decolonization. And in doing that, then I think that the focus on equality that Khalidi and Ayman Odeh are featuring in their rhetoric, featuring in their programs, is probably the most effective way to bring Israelis and Palestinians together and to reduce the suffering that is being endured by Palestinian people. Now, what is the argument against that? The argument against that is that Israel is still a fortress state supported reason. If you are a citizen or if you are living in Gaza in a state of despair, having just endured yet a fourth war between Hamas and Israel, you would not find Ayman Odeh's appeals to be appealing in any way. Ayman Odeh draws from the heritage of Martin Luther King Jr., who argued even the day before his death in 1968 that he believed that nonviolence was the only alternative to the only way to solve the problems of humankind. Odeh believes that as well. So if you take violence off the table, then the only alternative is cultural diplomacy. And diplomacy can be effective if it is marshaled in a creative and thoughtful and humane manner. And so my hope is that Ayman Odeh's vision, which he expressed in his first speech to the Knesset in 2015, will be accomplished. Indeed, Ayman Odeh in that speech began by envisioning what Israel might look like in 10 years if Israelis and Palestinians use cultural diplomacy to deal with their problems. And in that maiden speech, in that first speech, Odeh said, if we work together, in 10 years, we will have ended the occupation, created a two-state solution, reduced crime in the Arab community, able to, he argued, if Israelis and Palestinians use cultural diplomacy, make this country, make the country of Israel the democracy that could shine as an example throughout the world. And so let me end there. Alfonso, should I go through the questions one at a time, or do you want to open this up for a conversation now?
Now, Jan will moderate and we'll ask those questions. Yeah, Professor, thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much, Alfonso. And thank you, Dr. Frank, for the speech. It was really enlightening hearing about the potential ways of how the cause of the Palestinian people can be advanced, especially through Ayman Odeh and Rashid Khalidi. I think they were fairly enlightening. So if you're ready, we can move on to the questions that have been posed by the interns at the Institute for Cultural Relations Policy, as well as the questions by the participants of this event. The participants are encouraged to send any of their questions in the Q&A chat here on Zoom or in the general chat as well. So moving on to the first question. How far do you think that the international legal regime, for example, the United Nations, veto power, recognition of state, diplomatic relations, etc., has failed to address the historic wrongs in the Israeli-Palestine issue? Where do you think we should have drawn the line in history to avoid such escalation?
The root of the problem goes back to 1948. And in 1948, the international community recognized the state of Israel, and Israel declared itself a Jewish state and a democracy. At that time, the UN failed to recognize, as did the Zionists, that there were Palestinians, there were Arabs on that land that deserved attention. Now, there were a number of partition plans advanced in the 1930s by the international community, but they did not come to pass. And so the first mistake that the international community made was to fail to recognize the need to offer 800,000 Palestinians who were dispossessed from their land a place that they could go. And so there were many remedies to that that were advanced by well-meaning people, but they were never put into place. The real problem, a second problem, can be traced back to 1967. And that is when the Israelis, and at that time, the UN should have placed great pressure on Israel to withdraw from those territories. It would have been in the interest of Israel to do so. There are many military folks within the Israeli establishment who now recognize that 1967 victory was Pyrrhic. It was actually counterproductive, and that Israel would be much more secure and much stronger had the military withdrawn to the 1967 borders in 1967. And the international community should have done more to do that. A third problem is that the international community has spoken eloquently about Palestinian suffering, but has not done nearly enough to reduce it with material means, as well as the other Arab countries in that region have given lip service to the Palestinian cause, but haven't done what they needed to promote either reconciliation between Israel and Palestine or the material needs that have been expressed by the Palestinians.
Thank you for the question. I think that it was especially informative on the mistakes regarding the establishment of the State of Israel and how the Arabs did not actually, Palestinian Arabs did not actually get attention from the international community. So moving on to the second question, relations between the government and an ethnic minority can be stabilized should the minority be included in the body politic. If not, then intercommunal tensions can rise. Palestinians have been marginalized by the State of Israel, and thus this idea or concept applies to them. Therefore, should the international community's primary aim be to pressure Israel to include Palestinians in the politics of Israel, and in political life in general, as we see, for example, with Ayman Odeh. Should those that communicate about the Palestinian cause focus on this aspect rather than focus on other topics?
Thank you for that good question. I return to the position of Edward Said and Rashid Khalidi, and their argument is that we are now in a position to acknowledge two facts. One fact is that there is a state of Israel in the Middle East that will not go away. The other fact is that there are Palestinians living in Israel. The other fact is that there are Palestinians in the diaspora under occupation of the West Bank and in an open prison in Gaza. And so the question then becomes, how do we acknowledge those facts and reduce Palestinian suffering? Ayman Odeh's vision, which includes the creation of a two-state solution and equal treatment of Palestinian and Jewish citizens inside the state of Israel, as well as some compensation for Palestinians who were forced off their homes in 1948, as well as an effort of thorough reconciliation, historic reconciliation between the Palestinians and Israelis, which would include the Israelis recognizing the fact that the Palestinians in 19 great trauma, a great disaster called the Nakba, and that the Palestinians in turn need to recognize that the Holocaust took place, 7 million Jews were murdered, and even though the Palestinians had nothing to do with it, the Palestinians need to understand that trauma of their fellow citizens. And that's the policy that I think that Ayman Odeh has outlined, and it's one that I think that the international community should foster and support by any means necessary.
Thank you very much. Especially, I think what is important that equal treatment of Israeli and Palestinians is extremely important in this conflict that has been ongoing, and it's something that should be present pretty much everywhere in the world. So moving on to the third question, Palestinian individuals have a long history of migration. Since the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, Palestinians have experienced several waves of exile and have spread into different host countries around the world. Are the Palestinian diaspora living in other countries the most effective communicators of the Palestinian cause? How can public opinion be most effectively transformed in the West or in other places?
If I may answer that question by drawing from my background and experience living in the United States, the Democratic Party in the United States is now turning in the direction of the Palestinian cause. The most recent war between Hamas and Israel has prompted a gentle but significant movement by progressive Democrats in the direction of, or at least becoming more supportive of, the Palestinian cause. And advocates are now aligning themselves with other progressive movements in the United States, including the Democratic Party, Black Lives Matters, and a host of other progressive social movements. The claim that the Palestinian American citizens make, again, is based on equality, that Palestinians in the state of Israel deserve equality, that Palestinians living under occupation in the West Bank deserve equality, and the people living in Gaza deserve equality. And those appeals in the American context are persuasive. And so I do think that the Palestinian diaspora, at least in the United States, has been effective in aligning the Palestinian cause with other causes that people are advocating in favor of social justice.
Thank you for the answer, especially on the discussion of American politics. We can see that there have been actually Palestinian American members of Congress, Rashid among others, Actually, she's the first one who have advocated for the Palestinian cause. So thank you for that question. Thank you for that answer, my mistake. So let's turn our attention to the relations between Israel and the Gulf nations. So in the context of the present global order, with improved relations and new forged ties between Israel and the Gulf nations, what effect would these improved relations have on the Palestinian people? Do you think that these improved relations are sustainable in the long term, or will these Gulf states return to their support for the Palestinian cause?
That's a complicated question because the Abraham Initiative that allowed the UAE and Bahrain and Morocco and one other country to align itself with Israel, I think sanctioned a pre-existing military and economic relationship. It really didn't, in my judgment, make much difference in the long run. Again, these Arab states have mouthed or have pretended like they are supporting the Palestinian cause, but they do so for their own domestic consumption. In their actions, they have not followed through. And so I do not think that the relations are necessarily improved. They are just now sanctioned with people signing treaties or agreements. My hope is that the two-state solution will continue to be an idea that the international community continues to support. My hope is that Ayman Odeh and his allies in Israel will be able to help Israel achieve the promise of democracy by treating its Arab citizens with dignity and equality, and that the Gulf countries will, over the long term, come to their senses and see that it is in their self-interest, the Palestinians, in a material rather than a symbolic manner.
Thank you very much for the answer to, I'm sure it's a complicated question that deserves an entire book. We can actually, the audience posed some great questions. So again, this really points to the US. So the future of the former Trump administration's so-called deal of the century is in doubt after the Palestinians prove that they are ready to resort to violence to oppose what they believe to be unfair Israeli policies. Is this Trump's deal of the century dead?
I don't think it was ever alive, and it was stupid from the origins. And so I'm hopeful we can sweep it up into the dustbin of history and move on to more promising avenues. Again, as I said, I think I've been pretty clear about my political preferences as an American citizen, that the Trump administration was a disaster beyond compare. And so I'm glad that Joe Biden is in place. I just am really hopeful that he will take seriously Palestinian suffering, because if, he's been a friend of Israel, a supporter of Israel, and if he can see that if Palestinian suffering leads to Israel, then maybe that will be the route to get him to take seriously the Palestinian cause. I want to be clear, the Palestinian suffering in its own right deserves to be featured and deserves to be at the top of the agenda. I don't absolve Biden of any responsibility, but I do believe that Joe Biden is a far better president than Donald Trump, and Biden's foreign policy team is light years better than the one that Trump assembled.
Thank you for the answer. So there is another question actually about Joe Biden. So Biden's administration has committed to a foreign policy centered on the defense of democracy and the protection of human rights. More recently, the president stated, "I believe the Palestinians and Israelis equally deserve to live safely and securely and enjoy equal measures of freedom, prosperity, and democracy. For Palestinians, the peace between these statements and their daily lives could not be wider." The space between these statements and their daily lives could not be wider. What specific measures can Biden take in order to achieve his administration's proposed goals?
you will note that he used the word equality twice. And political observers noted that because that hasn't been embedded in the language of US presidents, that is featuring the equality, the need for equality between Palestinians and Israelis. So symbolically, that was an important step. Second, that Biden is going to reopen the consulate in Jerusalem, because that then indicates that the Palestinian community and the US government will start up a conversation again. Third, the Biden administration reinstituted the $300 million commitment that the US had been making to reduce Palestinian suffering through the vehicle of the UN. That $300 million was cut by the Trump administration. So that's a significant advantage. Fourth, the Biden administration supports, as Ayman Odeh does, the creation of a two-state solution. And as you just read, Jan, the rhetoric that Biden has emphasized, that is around the concept of equality, is one that Ayman Odeh, as an Arab citizen of Israel, has emphasized. And so Israel should do, or the US should do everything within its power to create the conditions of equality. The first step should be to end the occupation and to stop the settlements. The second step would be to stop the settlement construction now. I would, the boycott and divestment movement, I think it's been modestly effective. As long as it doesn't target the elimination of Israel, I think it does have some potential.
Thank you for the answer. I think that this is a complicated, again, question to really answer, because again, this conflict has been ongoing for quite some time. So moving on to our second to last question. Recently, Israel accused 6 Palestinian human rights groups of terrorism. To what extent does this incident compromise the future dialogue between the two entities, Israel and Palestine?
There is no evidence that Israel has produced that the 6 Palestinian human rights organizations that are targeted by the Israelis sponsored terrorism. There's no evidence at all that I have seen that's been presented in the public realm. And so it's a ridiculous, counterproductive move on the part of Israel. I know I have been interviewed some of the leaders of those human rights organizations, and they are simply trying to reduce the suffering of Palestinians. I do think that the incident does compromise the Israeli government's and efforts to suggest that it's seeking to resolve or to deal with the Palestinian suffering. And I'm hopeful that the Israeli government will come to its senses. I don't have great hopes for that.
Thank you for the answer. Hopefully they will come to their senses on this issue. And lastly, this is talking about the current events. So what's next in the latest Middle East convulsion? Do you think that there will be a ceasefire between the Hamas militant group in Gaza and Israel, brokered by Arab mediators in coordination with Western powers, or will the situation continue to deteriorate?
I believe that the Palestinians need a Marshall Plan. And in the wake of World War II, the United States invested a significant amount of money to reconstruct Europe after World War II. The Palestinians, because of the great trauma they suffered in 1948, and because of the suffering they are enduring under occupation, and because of the inequality that they face within the state of Israel, need significant material support. Without that, people who are living in Gaza, who are suffering from significant electrical shortages and food shortages and medical shortages, will turn to resolutions or solutions that they think will help them. And unfortunately, when people are desperate, they turn to violence. And I see on the horizon yet another fifth Hamas-Israeli war. And the Israelis continue to be far more powerful militarily than Hamas, although in the last exchange, Hamas did some damage. And so all to say, if we are to end the cycle of violence in that area, we need the US needs to bring into balance the amount of money that they give to the various parties. Right now, the US is providing Israel with $4 billion and the Palestinians with $350 or $300 million. So, $4 billion versus $350 million, that's out of whack. And then the international and the Arab communities, Arab countries need to step up and provide more support for people who are living in desperation in Gaza. And the Israelis need to end the occupation, stop the settlement construction, and create the conditions necessary for a two-state solution that would allow for a contiguous connection between the West Bank and Gaza. And again, all those issues would, I think, deserve yet another Alfonso constructed forum for you.
Thank you very much for your informative answer. I agree that we need equality between the parties. That's probably the most important thing that we can really do. And that would conclude our Q&A session. So I will now pass it to the host, Afonso, to make the concluding remarks of the session. And I'd like to thank you once again, Dr. Frank.
Thank you for the great questions.
Thank you, Professor, for your input, which comes in a truly timely moment. We are about to end the first year of Biden in front of the United States, and the incident with the 6 NGOs was widely addressed by many journals all around the world, and this is definitely a very urgent question. So thank you very much, Professor. And on behalf of the Institute for Cultural Relations Policy and myself, we really appreciate your presence, and we are honored to have you with us, to have had you with us today. Thank you again, and hope to work with you, Professor, again someday.
Thank you. It's a great honor. Thank you very much.
Thank you.